Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Salauda from Tosa Together. I'm delighted to welcome you to Tosa Talks, Building a Diverse and Thriving Community. This ongoing Facebook Live series was created to provide learning opportunities and foster meaningful discussions around racial and social justice issues in an effort to help build an inclusive anti-racist community. Tosa Talks will highlight the experiences and efforts of local neighbors, community leaders, business owners, employees, and government or organizational representatives, as well as provide relevant and sought-after information from local experts on anti-racist, equity, and inclusion issues. Each presentation will be featured in one of 3 tracks. Tosa Talks kicked off last week with the Personal Stories track that streams live on the second Tuesday of each month. Today, we are excited to feature educational strategist Linetta Davis for the Equity and Inclusion Issues track, which is live on third Wednesday of each month. We hope you will also join us for the Government Departments, Agencies, and Organizations track, streaming live on the last Thursday of each month. All presentations will begin at 7 p.m. live on Facebook and include an interactive question and answer session at the end. No registration is needed, and presentations will also be recorded and available for later viewing. All 3 Tosa Talks presentations in August are focused on school equity issues. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Equity and Inclusion Issues host, Robin Luther, who will introduce tonight's presenter.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. We're really glad you can be here with us tonight. I am so excited to introduce you to Linetta Davis. And she's an education strategist at Ubuntu Research in Milwaukee. And Linetta has provided me with some information for a really lovely bio. She is first and foremost a Black woman. Linetta Davis is an author and an educator from the city of Milwaukee. She earned a BS in English from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and her master's in educational leadership from National Louis University. She also holds a post-baccalaureate teaching certificate through the Metropolitan Milwaukee Teachers Education Program. Linetta's primary work is within public schools, working with middle school children and helping them find their voices through writing and to use those voices as outspoken community members. Additionally, she has implemented and developed strategies that advance students academically, socially, and emotionally. Linetta bridges her work in her classroom community with the larger community via family literacy events, poetry, original plays, and mostly by being an engaged citizen, mother, and wife. Hello, Linetta. We're so glad you're here.
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure to welcome you. We're really excited to have you speak tonight. I know we met earlier and talked about some different topics that you wanted to bring up, but I thought a nice way to start might be just to get us all up to speed by giving us a brief idea of what racial equity in the classroom means and why you think it's so important.
Well, ideally, just on a very basic level, just race equity, right? But the idea is actually that the system that it currently is was never meant for us. The system that is, we're still operating off of the earliest model of educating in the United States. And that model promoted racism, it promoted sexism, it promoted the patriarchy. And that is why we still have issues in our society, because Craig Stephen Wilder in his book, Ebony and Ivy, he talked about the 3 pillars of our society that promoted racism. And that is the government, the church, and academia. And so why do these ideas persist? And it's because these are the things that children are being taught in schools. Some of it is maybe taught in homes as well. But the idea of one group of people being inferior and another group of people being superior, Black, white, male, female, that's why we continue to have these problems. And that's why I think it's so difficult for us to, we have a vision of racial equity, but it's so difficult to bring it to pass because we're still using the same system that promoted it in the first place. And so ideally, what would that look like? That would look like all children thriving, flourishing, using critical thinking skills and creativity, using their voice And the outcome of that would be a positive and productive society, a positive, productive America, where we can think through everything. We can problem solve together. We can resolve conflict in a reasonable manner, because there is no idea that one group of people is inferior to another group.
Thank you. Thanks for that good start. I know that you think that you feel that implicit bias has a big role in racial inequity. Can you start your discussion of implicit bias by giving us a definition, and then relating how and where it appears in the school setting and the effect that you feel like it has on student performance?
Mm-hmm. So implicit bias is that unconscious belief that you have or prejudice about a certain group of people. The problem is that implicit bias impacts behavior. So however we think about a certain people or a person, that is how we're going to respond to that person. And there's been so many studies about implicit bias and its impact. Going back to the earlier point about how academia promotes these ideas, in Malife Keita Asante's 2 sets of notes, he shared some research from Dr. Kondo that talked about what Black students learn from their time being in school. But when I presented this information to my middle schoolers, my idea is this is what everybody learns from school. You learn that Black people are inferior, white people are superior, men are better, and all of that kind of stuff. And so this is what we're taught. And we don't know anything any different. And so we navigate out into the world with these beliefs. And the problem is that we come into contact with children in classrooms, and we bring those beliefs with us. And we see the impact of those beliefs because Yale did a study on in their child center, and they found that in preschool, Black boys especially, but Black children in general, but more specifically, Black boys are suspended and expelled in preschool more than white students. And this is when we're talking about like the same offense, nothing different, the same offense. Another study was done to show the impact of implicit bias on when a teacher, well, the study was, I think this was done by Stanford. They showed a picture on the screen and asked teachers to identify where the behavior problem was going to start or where it was coming from. But what the participants in the study didn't realize was that part of the study, they were using the webcam to see where the eyes went. And the eyes always went to the Black child because it's assumed that the problem was going to come from the Black child. And so what that does is when you're in a real life situation and you're in a classroom with children, you automatically assume the worst from that child. You automatically assume that that's where the trouble came from. And so we have a lot of children before they even gotten out of preschool are already having negative experiences in school, are already questioning who they are as people when they are already being challenged based off of some preconceived notion set upon them by someone else. And so that's the negative ramification of that. And it's so many other studies to show how we know about the names now. Like if there was a study done to show that if a group of teachers looked at a child's name and the child's name was, let's say, Jaheen versus, let's say, Dean, then automatically the Black sounding name, the teachers assumed, okay, this kid needs to be suspended, this kid is a troublemaker, this kid is at risk. And for the same behavior, Dean, which was assumed to be non-Black or white, oh, well, maybe, something is going on at home, maybe we can have, a conversation with this child. So the approach is completely different. And so everyone has stereotypes, everyone has implicit biases, but the problem is when we allow those to impact behavior and we make decisions about people, especially children, based on our own preconceived notions.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Just a follow-up to that, if implicit bias is is really an unconscious thing that we all have, how do you start to interrupt that process of implicit bias as an adult? How do you interrupt that after years of those formulated biases being part of your nature?
Right. I think we have a great opportunity now with everything being on screen. Everything is being recorded. And I think there's opportunities when you see someone do something that you feel like you would have done, then you start to question yourself. I think everyone, especially when you become an adult, you have to go through the process of questioning those things that you were taught, and going through the process of even unlearning some of those things that we were taught. I've been in conversations with educators in the city of Milwaukee who are white, who told me that they can go their entire day without interacting with a person of color, specifically a Black person. Why is that okay? And so by making that statement, then they need to start asking themselves, well, why is that? Why do I not seek out something else outside of, because for me, as soon as I turn on the television or I go out the house, there's that initial interaction.
Right.
So, so when we start to ask ourselves questions about, or why don't I know things about other people outside of my own race or my own nationality? Why don't I know anything else? And just start to question, start to undo those theories. And also, when our theory, our espoused theory, is in contradiction to what we actually do, our practices, that's when we take note of that, that's the moment when we start to say, hey, well, why am I like this? Or why did I make that decision? And start to actually work to unlearn that.
Right. So related to implicit bias is a discussion on deficit thinking. It must tie together. Can you tell us what is deficit thinking first, and where does it appear in the school setting, and what are the effects of deficit thinking? It's different from implicit bias.
Well, it's almost like the action of implicit bias, if you will. So you have the deficit thinking. It's sort of the same, but it's more. The deficit thinking is low. No one rises to low expectation. So I already don't expect anything from you. And sometimes you see this in well-meaning teachers. You automatically assume your children don't have access to the internet, so then you don't give them research projects to do at home. Or you think that they don't have access there. You think that their parents are poor and so can't go to the store and buy them resources for projects. So then you buy all the projects and then they have to do all of the work at home. I mean, in the school setting, that there's no outside project for them to do. So the automatic assumption that people lack. And again, no one rises to low expectations. So then what happens is, there's some research in a study, is white teachers and the impact on Black student achievement or something to that effect. And it says that teachers who approach their students with deficit thinking and that was the word that was used, will never increase student achievement because they have low expectations. And so you can't push your child. You can't say something that I say to my students, we're going to Saturn. We're leaving off this whole planet. We're going way beyond anybody else's expectations. You can't say that when you don't really think that. If you think that, oh, single parent, come from 53206, some other things. Yes, those things are challenges. Yes, they are definitely challenges. But then when you respond to that deficit thinking by not challenging your student, by not saying, hey, I have high expectations for you. Let's figure out what you need in order for you to be successful. That's a different approach. That's a way different approach than, oh, I'm not even going to expect you to do anything because you don't have. And previously the study that I brought up on implicit bias, that shows up because we've all been taught the same thing. We've all been taught from the same books in the same public school system, all of us have that implicit bias. And those of us who don't have it, we've made a conscious decision to unwork that and unlearn it, because we know the harm that it causes. To enter into a conversation with somebody, you automatically assume that they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the experience, they don't have the exposure that you have. As a teacher, that's detrimental, because you'll never be able to raise student achievement for that child.
Okay. So part of what you're saying is that deficit thinking is more of what you do. It's not necessarily that you have the facts wrong. It's your expectations of what comes because of the facts. So you might have a student from a single parent family, but you are assuming that because of that, you expect less of that child.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You don't.
So even if you have the facts,
like
you might not have them.
What that looks like is you might not even hold that child's feet to the fire. You know, if you have all of your kids in the classroom and you have a project that's due, and you assign it, you have high expectations, you know everybody's going to do it, but then when Sarah doesn't come and she doesn't have hers, and you say, oh, well, that's okay, because, well, I know you come from a single parent household, so maybe your mom was, I don't know, smoking crack or something, whatever all the other stereotypes are, so you couldn't get your work done, and so you don't push Sarah, when that may have not even been the case. It could have just been, so the deficit thinking is the assumption that you're making that stops you, especially in the classroom, from pushing a child to the highest level to achieve excellence, because the fact of the matter is you really don't believe that child can succeed. And that showed up in this other, this one study that I love to reference. It's the Kalamazoo Promise. So apparently in Kalamazoo, is that Missouri? I don't know. I'm a typical American. I'm terrible with geography. So, but I want to say it's Missouri or Michigan, I think. So the school system was not doing well, and the relationships with the children were poor. Like the teacher had low expectations. The students weren't achieving, and then something happened where Kalamazoo as a city decided that if you graduate from high school, we're going to pay for college for everyone. So the children didn't automatically want to go to college the next day when that promise came out. What happened was, for the teachers, they realized every one of these students can go to college. And so their whole mentality changed. And the students reported that they had better relationships. The teachers were more understanding, but they also challenged them more, and they kept talking about, well, so when you go to college, you're going to need this, so I have to teach you that. Everything was directed to that, but prior to that promise, that didn't happen. And the only thing that changed was, I know that you'll be able to go to college because of this promise, and that's it.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions that are coming in, but I think I'm going to move on to the next topic, and we'll go back to questions in our question and answer session at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I know that your work often focuses on eliminating exclusionary discipline, another factor of racial inequality in schools. Can you define the concept of exclusionary discipline for us and give some examples of how it occurs or where it occurs in the school system?
So the exclusionary discipline is just when children are removed from the learning environment. So suspensions, expulsions, when they're taken out of the classroom and they are not there they're not given the opportunity to learn, to be in the learning environment. And so, yeah, sometimes that's going to happen. Kids have a fight or do something heinous and they have to go home. But the problem is that data shows that for every suspension, it reduces the child's chance to go to college. It reduces the child's chance at going to college, and the more that happens, then it reduces their chance of even graduating from high school. And so, okay, maybe you don't want to go to college, but the other flip side to that is it increases their chances of going to prison. And so that exclusionary discipline is tightly connected to the school to prison pipeline. That whole idea of zero tolerance. You break this rule, you go home. You can't. There's no redemption. There's no restoration process. It is simply you leave here, and there's nothing for you here. And so ultimately, that's going to affect the child's relationship or interest in school. And we see that happening. And so right away you have that connection to the school to prison pipeline, because they haven't been in school, they haven't been prepared for real life. And so prison is waiting. And there is a direct connection to that. And so I saw that, and so it's easier and easier to suspend kids, and that's the problem. But when we're talking about racial equity, what we have to look at is, for the same offense, Black boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended for the same offense than a white student. And for Black girls, it's even worse. For Black girls, for the same offense, are more likely to be 6 times more likely to be suspended and removed from the school. So remember the earlier study, the Yale study, talking about this is already happening in preschool. So from preschool all the way through, you're more than likely to get suspended. And that's even more of a problem when we realize that some of these suspensions and behavior issues are because of something inside of the teacher. That implicit bias piece, that deficit thinking, is something within the teacher. I think it was Chicago Public Schools or some major public school that was doing away with the option of putting on a suspension willful defiance. Because what is that? Or I know something that I've been aware of in the past is just saying, oh, chronic disruption, disrupting the learning environment. And so then a kid is suspended from there. But we don't ever give them the opportunity to come back and have a conversation with the teacher about what happened, or even if they did do something, the opportunity to own what they did so that they can learn from it, which is character building. But just sending them home, there's no conversation, there's no how do we fix it, there's no skill building around what happens. That's the exclusionary discipline piece, and it's been shown to be detrimental to every child because it reduces their chance of being positive, productive members in society.
Thank you. Thank you. I think let's shift into ways to address this issue. I know that it's obviously a very large issue that has to be addressed in many ways, but one proactive solution that you've offered is the practice of restorative justice, which sounds like it's very much connected to exclusionary discipline and things that are as ways to address that problem, both in the classroom and in a broader school environment. Tell us about restorative justice, who would be important to the process, and how could it be brought into a school system successfully, and what effect do you see it having?
Well, a lot of schools have already implemented restorative justice or restorative practices. And it's a simple measure really of taking the time to ask the child, like, what happened to you? As opposed to what did you do, a more accusatory approach. It's like, what happened? Or why did you make this decision? Since we know that exclusionary discipline, again, lowers their chances of being positive, productive members of society, going to college and all of those things. Right. Why not do something different? And so the something different is a more restorative approach. And in that restorative approach, you are teaching accountability, you're teaching conflict resolution. And I think the problem is why it's so uncomfortable for us, or something that we don't just take on and hold on to, is because a lot of teachers are still probably holding on to the idea, hey, I just came to teach English, or I just came to teach math. But restorative justice is a whole, in the school setting is a whole child approach, because you understand that one day, maybe 10 years from now, you're going to run into this child And for me, when I run into this child, wherever it is, in the bank, in the emergency room, in the dark alley, I want to be confident that I taught that child how to catch his feelings, catch his or her feelings, how to control themselves, how to have a conflict resolution conversation with someone, and to own who they are and their part in something when they cause harm to others. But the other part of it too is it works both ways. It's not just something that the child has to do, because we as teachers are human beings as well. And so there may be times, well, this is how restorative justice has shown up for me, where my student can say, excuse me, Ms. Davis, can I talk to you in the hallway? Can I speak to you in the hallway real quick? Yeah, I didn't like what you said in class, that bothered me. And so there's an opportunity to have a conversation. And I think that's much more effective. That's what I want to put out into the world, a person who knows how to have a conflict resolution conversation with somebody, hold them accountable, expect respect, and let people know when they didn't do it, but without flying off the handle. Because in other ways, that child could have flipped over a desk, that child could have, I don't know, used profanity in class, but instead, because that child was modeled that type of behavior and given dignity in that process, which is something that Dr. Monique Liston talks about, is that the idea of dignity, that reciprocal self-worth. Then we see this person evolving. We see this positive, productive citizen that can go out into the world and do whatever he or she imagines, because they have those skills to have a constructive conversation with someone without flying off the handle, without being violent. They can call people to the carpet, and they can also own their own, they can own their own harm when they've caused it. And so that's ideally what we want. But we run into the issue of not having that, because I don't know why. I don't know why it's easier. But I just want to share this one moment, which I think that whole restorative piece, or at least just asking a student what happened as opposed to being in a disciplined mindset, it changed me. So a few years ago, I was a dean of students at a school in the city, and they had uniforms, but the uniforms changed every other day. So there was a student who just couldn't get it right. The day he was supposed to wear a blazer, he had on a polo, or the day he had on a blazer, he was supposed to have a tie. And so the policy at the school was they would be taken out of the classroom and or sent home if they didn't have the proper uniform. So maybe after about 10 times of this happening, I was ready to just drop down the discipline on them. Like, okay, you got to go home. But something in me said, no, Linetta, ask him why he doesn't have on the correct uniform. Because as an adult, I'm like, this is my job. I have to do this, right? But then something said, no, Linetta, ask him why he doesn't have on the correct uniform. And this 14-year-old explained to me how when he leaves school, he has to make sure his sister does her homework. He has to make sure dinner is prepared. He has to make sure she takes her bath, get her clothes out for tomorrow. Then he has to turn around and do those things for himself. And so by the time he goes to sleep, or when he wakes up in the morning, he just grabs the first thing that he sees that's clean and he runs out the door. And that, because what would have happened to that young man if I would have just kept being a stickler about that rule? So what did I do? I went out and I bought 5 blazers and white shirts and ties. And so just in case, if you forget, you can just come right in here. This one specifically is for you. And I think that's the work, is being a teacher, fighting against racism and deficit thinking and implicit bias. All of that is heart work. It's heart work. And if we're trying to do it where we're only going to teach this subject, we're not going to be open to anything, that's where we're going to run into problems. Because dignity as reciprocal self-worth, that the classroom should be the first place where that shows up. Because for myself, as this woman that I am, a lot of it is largely due to the experiences that I've had with my students. So yes, I went into it trying trying to help them change them, but they've helped and changed me as well. And so if we're going to be change agents in the classroom, if we're going to deconstruct racism, sexism, all of these isms in the classroom, we have to know that it's hard work, and we have to be ready for it to fix and change us as much as we want to fix and change children.
When you're implementing restorative justice, Linetta, is this something that you model for your students, or do you actually talk about it? And are there processes? Is it like a toolkit that you can provide to adults and children for how to do this?
It's a lot. So there's a lot of research out, but it's very it's in a lot of native practices. If a student causes harm in a class, like let's say stealing everybody's pencil out of their desk. So my practice would be to have a conversation with a child who did it, and see if I can present enough evidence for him or her to say, okay, yeah, I did it. And then I ask, well, why did you do it? Well, because I wanted to get attention from my peers, because I don't feel like that they want to be my friend. Okay, so you have to repair the harm. You got to have a conversation with your class. And then we go in and we have a circle, and then the students express how they felt about things being taken away from them. And then that student says, acknowledges how those students felt. And then they work together as a community to figure out, okay, what can we do? And that's the difference, because the alternative would have been to suspend him, right? You stole, right. You can't steal in school, so you're suspended, but it fixed nothing. This way with restorative practices, everything is fixed. Kids get their pencils back, they understand the hurt. Maybe they were doing some isolating of that student so they can work together, come up with a plan. So there's a lot of things out there, but generally it's hard work, it's conversations. Yes, you might need to look at a couple books on a repairing harm script, like how do you have that conversation with kids or between adults. So there's a lot of research out there, but primarily it's making sure that you take time to have a conversation. And as a teacher, being willing to step out of that, I guess, authoritative role and more into an inquiry role or a problem solving or a facilitator. I'm just here as a facilitator to make sure you guys have a conversation about this situation. And oftentimes the kids figure it out for themselves.
It's really interesting. We have a lot of questions piling up. If you don't mind, I'm going to switch to, is that okay to go to Facebook questions for a little bit?
Sure.
Let's see, I don't have a name on this one, but there's a woman, well, actually I don't know if it's a woman. After 15 years of having lived with biases, is questioning oneself enough? What resources are available to myself, but more importantly to our teachers? Is there any place you can point people to go to help them recognize their implicit biases and really learn how to interrupt them?
Well, I think it was Harvard that has actually an online test where you can identify your implicit bias, or you can see which one you favor most. I think it should be pretty obvious to most people. But besides that test, I can't think of anything. I know that we know that we live in a racist society. We know we live in a sexist society. So I think during that internal inquiry on, okay, am I racist? Am I sexist? What practices align with this thinking? What things have I learned from my parents that maybe I need to unlearn? What are some things that I'm just acting on because that's what society says? And so that's the only thing that I can think, besides the Harvard test, that'll just confirm that you have implicit bias towards a group or not. Any advice for people who take the implicit bias test and it comes back and it tells them you are racist, you have implicit biases, and that automatic defensive reaction that people have to that? I think, and yeah, just start having conversations. A lot of people like to say, I'm not racist because I have a Black friend. Well, some people say, if you know how many Black friends you have, then you probably are racist. But even an implicit bias goes beyond just race. But I think having the courage to have that conversation, that's the only thing that I can think of. I am a part of the Table, which is a first century style, I forget that other word, church, where we have house church. And it is quite a diverse mix of people of different social economic backgrounds, as well as race and ethnic groups. And we sit down at the table and we have conversations. And we get to the bottom of a lot of things because we have the courage to ask conversations. But in saying that, let's be careful not to latch on to the opposite, or a person of color, and feel like they have to teach you all of these things about how to not be a racist. There's a lot of books out here. There are a lot of webinars. There are a lot of things like that where, because it is hard work. So anything that you're trying to learn, what do you do when you're trying to learn something? What do you do when you're trying to unlearn something? You go and get information, you ask who knows, you have conversations. But because it's 2020, let's be careful not to put the responsibility on a Black woman to give you all the keys on how to not be racist. Like, you have to go, and that sounds abrasive, but that's the reality. Because even while there are people who are trying to unlearn racism, there are people who are still being heavily oppressed by it. And then so to put that responsibility on us to then stop what we're doing and then teach you so that you can feel good about not being racist, well, that's not really, or having bias against another person.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really a good feeling, and that's not our responsibility. But there's a lot of information out here. You know that show, What Would You Do?
Yes.
that's a perfect start. Because it does leave you with that question, what would you do in that situation? And not to just brush it off, but really sit down and think about, why would I do this? Why would I have said that? I think that's a really good start to deal with some of those things, and not be afraid, or if I'm responding to, if this is a white person asking this question, not be afraid or easily offended when someone calls you on your bias, or how you're showing up in a space, exerting your privilege or whatever else. How, like, okay, well, I apologize. Well, let me figure out what it is that I need to do. But I feel, and what I've taught in my classroom, that a lot of things can be solved with a conversation, a courageous conversation, where people are actually listening. Both sides are listening. I think that's a good start.
Yeah, you have read our minds and answered the next person's question about how to bring people to the attitude of listening and learning, instead of assuming we know what we don't know.
Yes, definitely.
There was another
activity that I was in. I think it's called constructive listening, where you have to listen to somebody say something and you can't, or yeah, I know, you can't do that. You have to simply be a sponge and take in all of that. You can't ask questions, because whatever that person said is that person's truth or their experience, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you. And I think that's a good practice.
Yeah. I'm staying very quiet while you say that.
I wasn't talking about you, Robin.
You could be talking about me. Here's another question. Someone is asking, do you have any advice for teachers as we form relationships with students in online only school, or when we see students only once a week?
Well, so that's the learning curve for all of us, right? So for me, education, that old adage, read and write and arithmetic, is also relationships. So using that opportunity to find out about your students. Maybe start lessons with a check-in. Don't get right away into the lesson. Maybe using, if you're on Zoom with the virtual background, we know about the zones of regulation, have your kid change their background to how they're feeling. And then maybe say, if someone is, I think, red, you can say, hey, can I see you for 5 minutes after class? And then I just want to listen. Just a lot of times, just providing that space for kids to listen, incorporating social emotional learning in your lessons, maybe even doing some, once you learn something about a child, or if you know that this is a thing that's happening, I think there's definitely a way to have circles virtually. I mean, who's going to tell you if you're wrong? Like, all of this is new. If you're putting forth that effort to do it, who's going to come in and say, that's not how you do a virtual restorative justice circle? Like, where's the precedent for it? Like, who's done it before? We have no idea. So I think you can totally make those things up. I think if we keep thinking it's hard work, like, I need to build a relationship with these kids, reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships. So I need to learn something about them. I also need to share myself. I think it's super important when kids really realize that their teacher is human.
Right.
A lot of that is really key for your students to know that you are a human being, that you make mistakes. And maybe one way that you can model that is when you start the class and your background is red because you're not having a good day. And then you'll see that, but you have to model what you want from them. And I think someone did say that you have to model that. So how would you want have the courage to think about, okay, if this were me, and this is how I had to learn as a child, what is it that I would want my teacher to do? And just be creative, and just know that as a teacher, our superpower as teachers is that we can just make it up. We're creative. Our job is to draw it out of the kids. Some of them already have an answer. Be courageous enough to ask the kids, okay, what do you think that we should do to make this more engaging or more fun? What could I do? Should I wear a silly hat? Should I put an aluminum foil on my head when we're reading sci-fi? Like, what should I do? And just find different ways to do that. There's different programs, I think, like Class Dojo, that was implementing a SEL component in there where you can ask kids about how they're feeling. So just look for different ways to check in with them emotionally outside of the academic piece.
Okay, excellent. Okay, here's a question from Ursula. You mentioned earlier that the online teaching provides opportunities for review and catching oneself of biases. Is that something that is actively done?
I don't know if I said that. I know the Harvard study lets you, based off of your questions, it lets you see where your implicit bias lies. The catching yourself was really me talking about, catching yourself when you see a situation or you see how someone responds to that situation, catching yourself and say, oh, I think I would have done it the same way. Okay, why would I have done that? You know, just like that 2 or 3 year old, they're just like, why? That's what I mean by being courageous. We have to do that to ourselves until we get to the root of why we're saying that, why we're saying something or why we're doing something.
Here's a question on back to restorative justice. If you are in a situation where you feel like you can empower your classroom or your kids or whatever group of young students you're working with to work in that model, but you have adults around you who are not supporting that, how do you bring this idea to the other adults in the room when it might feel like a little threatening to their authority position?
Well, I think you might be asking the wrong person for that, because I'm the rebellious teacher and I just did it. For me, it was in the results. So I think when you're implementing something, you always have, especially when you know that that's the environment that you're in, have the data ready. Like, this is a common practice for social emotional learning, is not taking away from academic time, because this is the time that we do it. And then when your children have a reduction in suspension rates or any other negative situation, you have that new data. So a colleague of mine, we both came to a school at the same time, kids 7th grade year, they were the oldest kids in the building, and there were nothing but bad things about these kids, like all of them. And within probably 6 months, but definitely by the end of the year, that was a completely and totally different environment, because we were willing to stick our necks out, take the time to do the hard work and have those conversations with the kids. And we saw a huge turnaround with those students. And because of that, because that social emotional piece was intact, because there was the dignity in place, that self-worth, that reciprocal self-worth, then academics also increased drastically because they had a safe space. So if anybody is challenging you, you have to figure out ways at first to do it within the rules. And then, once you know the rules, you can break them. But I think the data, all social emotional learning all data shows that restorative justice works. So have that ready for the naysayers, and then you will be able to back that up a few months down the line when your students feel good about being in your class and they're not presenting any behavior issues.
Wonderful. Well, we're running out of time more quickly than we want to. We have a lot of comments about just admiring all the words that you're saying, admiring your energy, and talking about the superpowers of teachers, which is just for sure real.
To be a teacher, if you think about it, it's the best.
Yeah.
If you have, I still have a little bit more time if you wanted to ask some more questions, Robin.
Is there any, we're coming up on 8 o'clock, not too long from now. Is there any thought that you would want to drill home for us? Any big thought that you would like to end on or bring back up? What should we be taking away if we need an elevator speech to say what we learned tonight?
Elevator speech. One of the things that when I was a school leader that I challenged teachers with was, and I did mention it briefly, when you run into these kids 10 years from now, are you going to be okay with how you left them when you saw them last? What will that conversation be like? And then the thing is, if you've been teaching this whole time, you probably won't remember them. We'll be older. It's too much work to be like, oh, was this a kid that I liked? Was this a kid that I gave a chance to? Or was this a kid that I suspended all the time? No, we won't have time to think about that. My former students come to me, they don't care about this personal space. They right here in my face. Do you remember me? I'm just like, I don't know. So, and that has literally happened everywhere that you can think of. In some places were scary. I've been on a dark street in the inner city of Milwaukee on 12th and Center with my baby in a stroller, walking down the street to my car. I hear a car, all the stereotypical things that you're supposed to be scared of. You hear loud music, you smell marijuana, all of that, people just kind of hanging out. And I'm just like, oh God. And then I hear, Ms. Davis, is that you? And then immediately, because I know who I was as a teacher, not perfect by any means, not always right, but definitely working and evolving to get to be the best teacher that I can be in that moment, all my fear went away. And I said, who is that? Come help me put this baby in the car. Like, I didn't even know who it was, but I knew who I was in that moment, in every moment with my students. And I also know that maybe if this was a kid that maybe we didn't get along too good at the time, that I know that I've had those conversations with them to say, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what it is about me that makes it difficult for us to get along. but I still want to give this another chance. Let's have a conversation. Come see me after class. Come see me after school. Do I need to come to your house so we can have a conversation? Like I was that teacher. And so I just challenge you all to be that teacher who is thinking of when I see you in 10 years. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to put into you now is going to benefit me when I see you in 10 years. And I think if we do that, then we'll be much more careful about the conversations that we have with children. We'll be much more careful about the lessons that we put before them, the discussions that we have, how we advocate for them, how we draw the line for them. I think we'll be much more intentional about the work if we know that we're going to run into them later.
That's beautiful. Well, we are coming to the end of our time. And I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. This has been a fascinating talk. If people are looking for more information, do you want to talk about what Ubuntu Research does or their impact on the
Sure.
community?
Sure. Our primary focus is, so Ubuntu Research and Evaluation. The idea of Ubuntu is I am because we are. So that's that humanistic piece. And so we do a lot of work with training and facilitation, coaching in schools, curriculum development, all of those things that will push us towards Black liberation and equity for all. And that's the primary focus. We are an organization of Black women. So of course, our heart is in those things that is gonna level that level playing field for Black women. But it is for all of us. And so we are doing a lot of work in regards to equity and leveling the playing field. We're doing that in schools, in different corporate organizations, in churches. We're everywhere, so it's coming. But a lot of our work is rooted in Dr. Monique Liston's doctoral work around dignity. And that's what I quoted her early on, the reciprocal self-worth. And so that's the basis of pretty much everything that we do. And so if you're in an organization that does not respect you as a human being, and in all those various aspects, then call us and we'll be there.
So work it out. Reciprocal self-worth and dignity. That's shown through everything you were talking about tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Linetta. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I really appreciate personally and on behalf of Tosa Together, we really appreciate your time and for sharing your expertise and your insights with us. And I want to also thank our Facebook audience for your time as well and for your comments and questions and support. One quick plug for next week, we have our next Tosa Talks track 3 will be on the last Thursday of the month, which is Thursday, August 27th. And this is the Government Departments, Agencies, and Organizations track. This month it will feature Dr. Phil Ertl, who's the superintendent of the Wauwatosa school system, and he will be discussing the district's school equity plan. So from me and from Linetta, I'm Robin Luther from Tosa Together, and it has been my pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks to all of you for being part of Tosa Talks and our mutual effort to build a diverse, thriving community. Good night, Linetta. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you.
Bye, everyone.